In contrast, not only were white persons overrepresented as victims of violence, people of color were overrepresented as perpetrators against white persons. Likewise, in the examination of homicide-suicide and its distinction from other forms of newspaper reporting of mugging and sex fiends, Websdale and Alvarez introduced the concept of forensic journalism to differentiate between those frames of reference that compromise or discredit interpersonal perpetrators as tainted, as contrasted with those news frames that deeply stigmatize or demonize offenders as folk devils. In the process, different kinds or levels of blame and stigmatization are achieved. In their study of newspaper accounts in Arizona, the authors go on to show how this kind of biased or distorted reporting of certain kinds of interpersonal, familiar as opposed to stranger, violent acts are couched in routinized terms that are supportive of patriarchal ideology. Such non-conspiratorial, and anything that I'm saying here today does not reek of conspiracy. I argue just the opposite, just to be clear. Such non-conspiratorial sources of dominant ideology, for example, fail to call attention to the obvious gender differences between male and female perpetrators of homicide-suicide. This type of forensic journalism also does not hold up as reflexive journalism in that it further fails to recognize its own kind of myopic and systematic inattention to the patterns of newspaper reporting of particular offenses. In other words, lost in this kind of forensic journalism characterized by an investigative motif or an ethic of detection that feeds off the minutia of the crime scene rather than on the social context in which the crime is embedded, are the structural sources or patterns of violence. This kind of forensic journalism and gender difference in reporting the news, as well as the portrayals and resolutions, especially in terms of fictional accounts of violence, tend to help mystify public understanding of violent behavior. Filmmaking is particularly revealing here. As Fruce has argued in documenting domestic violence in American films, because, quote, Hollywood films are experts at providing illusion of reality, no matter how fantastic the story, they are an important source of our mythology about family violence, end quote. You could say the same thing about romance novels. What she documents and what other analyses of women in American cinema have shown is that for the most part, depictions of domestic violence after all these years still help to perpetuate the following 8 myths. Beatings leave no permanent damage and there are no consequences. Batterers are not like us. They're mobsters, immigrants, or lower class. Women enjoy rough sex and secretly want to be raped. Women who are battered are asking for it. Women as batterers are as abusive as male batterers. Ordinary men don't batter or abuse mates and children. Women can stop the abuse by leaving the batterer. Women who successfully escape their batterers do so by themselves. This is not to say that there are not exceptions to the rule, such as Sleeping with the Enemy, starring Julia Roberts. Even in this film, however, her abuser husband was not some kind of ordinary fellow. On the contrary, he was extremely rich, obsessive-compulsive, and a borderline psychopath. More generally, as Fruce and other film scholars have argued, by including action, thriller, and suspense genres, it can be shown that films, through their constant depiction of misogyny and violence against women, contribute to a cultural context that has, until very recently, and with the exception of the new female adventurer warrior heroines, encouraged the subjugation and battering of women. Perhaps no group of women in recent memory was more maligned by media stereotypes than were African American females during the height of the U.S. war against welfare queens and mothers giving birth to crack-addicted babies in the late 80s and early 1990s. Whether discussing prime time and local news stories or the more full-blown entertainment versions viewed from shows like 60 Minutes, Dateline, and Nightline, and so on, portrayals zoomed forth of African American women trading crack for sex, or rather sex for crack, rather than of middle-class white women snorting the more expensive powder cocaine, while the former group of women became the appropriate targets for the criminal justice system or prosecution and lockup. The latter escaped negative scrutiny by having access to medical personnel and the confines of private detoxification facilities a la Russ Limbaugh. Finally, when stories of upper-class violence reflective of economic and political arrangements are occasionally broached, they are done so in a comparatively subdued fashion, so that these violent actions are viewed as less threatening than those actions associated with lower-class violence, and the perpetrators of these acts are viewed as tainted rather than as folk devils. In any event, whether portraying interpersonal, white-collar, or corporate violence, mass-mediated representations of these actions are rarely, if ever, located within the social or cultural relations of production. As for the causality and morals of these news stories, they are almost always about individual behavior, disassociated from or free of any communication about the organizational, institutional, or structural nature of the conditions underlying these violent encounters. They are vacuous in a nutshell. Moreover, in the media of films and literature specifically, and even journalism, but to a lesser degree, violence is often put to use through shifting mythic and ideological imperatives, such as the war on terrorism. I'm almost to the third section, and they get smaller each section. I know I'm dealing with time here. All right, let me think about the war on terrorism as involving shifting mythic and ideological imperatives. Just hold that thought. Let me move to the last portion here, because this is really the more far out material compared to what's come forward. And then the empirical material I don't get to. Cinema Review in the contemporary period examines mediated violence from the points of view of both historical materialism and psychoanalysis. These examinations focus on the primacy and valorization of bloodletting within existing representational practices. Such reviews are hardly exercises in social science, let alone efforts that try to establish even loosely some tentative causes of violence in contemporary civilization. On the contrary, these are exercises in the mythologies of violence, not in any Jungian sense suggestive of the archetypal, mystical, or the endemic presence of violence within humanity. These postmodern film critics of violence representation rather sensitize us to the mythic realities of mediated violence that operate as ideologies or as a series of narratives that conflate nature with culture, tending to have us believe that certain attributes are given and immutable. More specifically, these postmodern film reviews attempt to map out the mediascape of sanctioned and unsanctioned violence, in the process demonstrating the importance of the violent image and text in furthering an atomized society that has been in the making since colonial forces took possession of the U.S. nation.